Good morning, everybody. I think, can you all hear okay? Fantastic. It's really lovely to be here and to be moderating, chairing a session on AI, which is so interesting and so fundamental for our futures. I should declare one interest on this. As the programme says, I'm on the Digital Communications Committee of the House of Lords. And our latest inquiry, we began in a closed session this week talking about this. Our latest inquiry is actually into AI. And can I do the first ever advertisement for a House of Lords Select Committee? But if you want to watch, it's being streamed at 2 p.m. Every Tuesday, and you're guaranteed some interesting stuff, so there we are. The issues are so important and fundamental, and it's great to have such good speakers coming to talk to us this morning. I mean, the issues I've been sort of thinking about a lot is one, which is why this seminar I think is so good. One is just knowledge and understanding of AI in all its complexities. And I think when you think about people who are going to have to regulate AI, but also deal with AI, work with AI, the need for a debate about what it is and what it is not, and where are we on the road to intelligence which is greater than ours, is fundamentally important. The second thing is we heard quite a bit about this in the first session this morning, which I thought was, again, really interesting, which is how you regulate AI and to what end. And I think to what end in regulation is always so important. Regulation is, of course, about values, making sure things are done properly, but it's also what end you want the regulated sectors you're looking at to be. And what, again, struck me in our sort of first briefing session with the Lords Committee on Tuesday was actually an awful lot of regulators are going to have to be involved. It's very interesting hearing in the first discussion about international regulation, but also when you think about the plethora of domestic regulators, all of whom are going to have to be up to speed with AI. How do you do it? And then the third thing, which I think is kind of, again, came out of a bit of a theme at the end of the discussion, which is our dependency on big tech for AI, and how do we cope with that? I mean, the blocks are, basically the US, versus China, and where do we sit outside the EU or with the EU? How do we cope with the fact that the big developments are there because that's where the power is, that's where the money is, and so on. So these are our big questions, I think, and we're going to hear a lot more about that over the next hour and a quarter. It's brilliant to have Ajit sitting here on my right. We've met before and we've had fascinating conversations about AI, and in a moment you're going to hear a presentation from him. We're also joined by Ziga Turk, who's a member of the Academic Council for the Wilfrid Martins Centre for European Studies, and he's also a professor at the University of Ljubljana, so he's going to be up on the screen in a second, and we hope the tech is working well for that. It's inevitable, by the way, anything which is to do with digital transformation, the tech always is wobbly. It's just one of those facts of life. And then also Simon Median-Staffeld, the Director of Government Affairs for Microsoft, again, who's somewhere here. Here they both are. Can I just say to you remotely, you're both very, very welcome. It's really good to see you. Thank you for being here. And now I'm going to ask Ajit to make his presentation. Ajit, you're most welcome.
Sure. Right, so this thing, good, this is working, very good, this is nice, yeah. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Tony, for the introduction. So I'm going to sort of have my presentation as a scaffolding, correct? Because then it's like a discussion, a catalyst for discussion. And so we created this report. We are creating this report on the digital world towards sort of looking at AI towards 2040. And kind of when I started to look at this for the first time, it's a daunting task, correct? I mean, it's like boiling the ocean, so to speak. And you can't predict AI for about 2 years, and yet we are going to try to predict something for 2040. And what we decided to do in that context was really that we kind of looked at 3 overarching themes. technology, economy, and society. And before I go too much deeper into that, what I wanted to say is that as a part of the University of Oxford, this is something I am quite used to doing. So every 3 months, I make a kind of presentation to my board to say where AI is going, and most of the time, sometimes they sort of think it's too weird, but after ChatGPT, when everybody's grandma has heard about it, then I think it's people realize that it's all going to happen. So the thing is that I'm very used to this thing, but the time frame was important. 2040 is quite an interesting time frame, as we will see. So we looked at it in 3 areas: technology, society, and economy and society. And we kind of looked at this term called intelligent autonomy. And that means that when machines acquire some form of intelligence and collaborate autonomously with humans. Now, this is actually the crux of AI. This tells you about jobs, about employment, about security, and everything. The question is, to what extent will you be ready to delegate something to a non-human entity, correct? And to where is the lever going to go? And to a large extent, we looked at a number of markers. So, for example, can AI detect humor? Correct? Can AI detect what is the reasoning capacity of AI? Because to the larger extent that is possible over the next decade or so, the greater is the sort of opportunity and therefore the risk of delegating tasks to AI. So it's all about collaborating with AI, with something which is growing exponentially, very rapidly. And we all have to look at the last 6 months to understand exponentially regarding to ChatGPT. So that was the first central paradigm of this discussion. And then we looked at it, we broke it down into artificial intelligence, autonomous collaboration, the economic and social impact of the European Union and the broader ecosystem, for example, sustainability. Correct? So we looked at all these different things. We have some definitions, which I won't go into that. I'll share the presentation with you. And then we looked at effectively what are the foundational technologies, what is the role of AGI towards 2040, and what is automation, correct? So what is the impact when we start to collaborate? Now, the word AGI is artificial general intelligence, and that the significance of that is OpenAI was the one and the only company other than the Singularity University folks, which were a little bit esoteric in their thinking, was OpenAI was the one company who said that our charter was to go to artificial general intelligence. So the word artificial general intelligence means that you have AI which can autonomously do multiple tasks as opposed to doing one thing, correct? For example, setting your thermostat is a monolithic thing, but be able to do lot things, be able to do documents and transactions is a multi sort of general intelligence. And the question was, what would take us there? And where would we go in the next decade and a half? Because the greater extent we did that, the more our life would change. And of course, the society would change and the economy would change as a byproduct of this capability. Therefore, the technology was extremely important, and the markers towards that was what we were looking for. And then we looked at a whole bunch of foundational technologies, because obviously everything from networks to chips and everything matters. And then we looked at effectively the capability of AI itself to evolve, correct? Because we have seen the releases of AI, correct? So what we have seen is the GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, at which point Elon Musk sent this letter to say that it should be stopped because people are realizing that the rate of growth is exponential. And once you start to see that, what you're starting to see is where is this going to go? What is the trigger to make it really, really sort of grow much bigger than anything else? And then we looked at jobs. And the question is, automation, of course, doesn't replace jobs, but the impact on jobs is going to be massive. Impact on skills is going to be massive. The requirement for education is going to be massive. So it's sort of bringing all these things together. And then we kind of built up the whole story around that. And we come to the economy. And the economy had 5 parts, again, which looked at the geopolitical considerations, the macroeconomic impact, regulation policy, work and productivity, and then, of course, things like systemic problems like sustainability. And now we look at the geopolitics of it. I saw this discussion in the morning regarding China and all these sort of things. And I think that the geopolitics are going to be important, mainly in the sense of values. Correct? I mean, we saw that with the internet. The internet started off with the quote-unquote Southern California mindset. And as it evolved, it fragmented into subcultures, for better or for worse. And today we do not have a single internet, nor do we have a single culture of the internet. You have the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians to a large extent as well, trying to fragment it in their own value system. So what will happen to AI? I think we are going to see something similar. But the trick here is that because it's generative AI is hard to control, even for regimes who want to control it. So it's very interesting where that would play out. Those were the 5 issues we looked at: the economy, and then we looked at all of these, which were again very good contributions from various EIF members and also various companies who we continue to engage with. And of course, if you have any thoughts on any of this, feel free to also talk to us. We looked at different areas like responsible AI, companies trying to do their own initiatives. Then, of course, there is a whole plethora of things around regulation. That's a subject in itself, with the sort of the EU AI Act being the umbrella, which is looking at what we are doing. And then we looked at the work and productivity. We looked at this McKinsey report, which talked about the massive change in work. It was triggered by one particular observation, was that the ability of AI to understand natural language, as has happened with GPT, is a huge driver to taking up work, AI taking up work. And what other sort of markers is it going to go through to be able to collaborate more? And I personally take a more pragmatic and a more positive view to say that young people, of course, would benefit immensely. We are working with various companies who talk about how code generation is a lot easier now, which means you don't have to write code from zero. You can have AI generate a lot of code for you, which makes life amazing for people. And the final part is the socio-economic section. Now, this is something which is still work in progress, and we looked at it from a perspective adoption of AI. And there are early adopters of AI, which are high adoption countries, medium adoption, and low adoption countries. Adoption, by the way, doesn't mean the originators of AI. So, for example, in the mobile world, we saw that Africa was a huge adopter of mobile technology. It was not created in Africa, but was highly adopted in Africa, including changes to business models like M-Pesa in Kenya, correct? So that's the sort of thing we're trying to figure out what's going to happen, learning from that experience. And then the final point I wanted to make is we also looked at AI from a perspective of authoritarianism. So we look at AI advanced democracies, AI authoritarian regimes, AI resistant communities, hybrid societies, and finally liberal democracies that adopt centralized standardization. That is quite important, the last one. So for example, we are looking at, for example, Korea and Japan, who have centralized standardization. Like in Japan, there is MITI, which is an organization which centralized standardization, which means you get very fast progress, but it doesn't scale to other places of the world. So the Japanese iMode system, for example, was hugely interesting, but it didn't quite. You had the iPhone, which was the globally dominating one. So with this, Tony, I will stop at this point, because this is a good framework of what we could discuss. And to summarize it, there are 3 parts: the technology, the economy, and the society. And we took this view of the intelligent autonomy, which is the ability for humans and AI to work in a semi-autonomous way, with the idea that AI is evolving very rapidly, and to what extent, where would that go leading up to 2040, and what does that mean for jobs in society is the question.
Ajit, terrific. Thank you very much indeed. I mean,
good.
Really, there's a huge amount
Yes.
to take in there. And what we might do, if it's possible, is to hang on to the presentation, and then you think of questions. And when we hear from our next 2 speakers, we might want to come back on some of those sections. But you know, the clarity of what you're saying is really, really terrific. So we're going to hear now from our 2 remote, in spatial terms, presenters today, and we're going to start off, if we may, with Simon Median-Staffel, the Director of Government Affairs in Microsoft, who I think is somewhere in this country, but very good to have you on board, Simon. Over to you.
Hello, thank you so much, and that was a superb presentation, so thank you for that as well, Ajit. I'm going to just frame maybe a few comments around what we've just heard, but I'm not going to try and do the whole thing because that was clearly ambitious in its scope, and so I will just pick 3 things that I just heard there that I thought were particularly salient and interesting to pull out. First of all, on this point about intelligent autonomy, which I thought was a really fascinating sort of frame that the presentation started with, and this idea of machines collaborating autonomously with humans. So much of the focus for us at Microsoft at the moment is actually around this concept of essentially not doing that. So it's very much around the idea of human augmentation. So how do the advances that we've seen with large language models getting to a level of sophistication and capability that, as you mentioned, has just sort of skyrocketed in the exponential growth. What happened with the exponential growth is something quite counterintuitive. Between 1950 and 2018, there's some great academic studies on this, which I'm sure people have seen. The increase in sophistication in machine language models increased by an order of magnitude of, I believe, about 7 orders of magnitude. But then between 2018 and 2013, they increased by a further 5. You can see how that, and you can imagine the curve. I can draw the curve on my screen, what it looks like. I'm sure you've all seen these curves. But the thing I find particularly fascinating about that is when you're at this point in the curve where the growth, which we've seen with ChatGPT and other models over the last few years, where you get to billions and then trillions of parameters, is something quite counterintuitive, because actually, in a way, it's quite democratizing, profoundly democratizing, because people have become more in control, even if they don't have the ability to understand in a deep way how the model works. Whereas previously, even if you were in the 1990s or probably even in the 1950s, unless you had a sophisticated understanding of how machine learning works, you wouldn't really have been able to engage with the systems. But now anyone can with a chatbot. So there's something about actually the increase in power flipping that sort of paradigm around autonomous versus actually augmented. And I think that's incredibly important. And I suppose the other question I would ask on this intelligent autonomy piece is, do we ever want the completely autonomous? Or do we need to sort of try to work out how, as we get towards this debate on AGI, how do we maintain human control and make sure that systems are kind of being used in a way that is that has guardrails and is in human control? Second point that I would make is on this point around geopolitics, which I thought was also fascinating, clearly huge geopolitical considerations. I think there's a real risk around fragmentation, which was mentioned in the presentation. I suppose a more optimistic point that I will try to point to, but I do think is incredibly challenging, is that potentially we can learn lessons from where this has not worked in the past, whether that's the internet or social media and other areas where we can clearly see how globally there was a problem and which was not regulated well, and there was not an agreed upon sort of interoperable way to maintain consistent and safe use. And there's been all kinds of challenges with that, safety, security, as well as the fragmentation point. So there is a question, I think, now about can countries globally, through things like the G7 Hiroshima process, the UN, the OECD, and all of the others that are sort of thinking about this at the moment, come up with something, a better way that overcomes some of those challenges. That's I know, very optimistic, but I hope there is. And I think there are some good analogies with other sectors like aviation and other areas, the model of international aviation, maritime, where there has been an interoperable global framework which has worked, where potentially domestic regulation can build from. And then the final point I would make is around AI taking up the work of humans and this risk around work displacement, which I think is really important. And the point about, there's various figures that have been used. McKinsey study, I think, says 50% of tasks in around 10 years' time could be conducted by large language model type technology. there are various different numbers. But whatever numbers you use, clearly the capability of the models does mean that more different kinds of productive work could be replaced by people, could be replaced by machines rather than people doing those jobs. And I think the really important point that I would suggest there is, how do we avoid that being a problem and being an opportunity? And I think fundamentally that's about reinforcing the idea of human agency to use these machines. I think there is a risk in some of the policy dialogue around this, that there's a risk identified, but the solution to the risk is very top down. So it's how does government or how do businesses stop that from happening? Whereas I think really the solution to that challenge is more around how do we empower individuals and increase the agency of people to use these technologies, which I think is the thing that's not necessarily happening to a sufficient degree at the moment, and sort of workers and students and people actually taking use of the technology and driving their application rather than it being sort of done to them. So re-injecting agency into that discussion, I think, is really fundamental to the sort of economy pillar of what was discussed in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. That was I mean, I took a lot away from that. The augmentation point. I think your learning from other forms of regulation where we've come together is really important. It leads you to the issues of, you know, where did China fit in, all that business too. But I thought your final agency point was very powerful, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. Ziga, over to you for your words and thoughts on this subject. And you're very welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm joining in from Poland. I'm just coming home from the economic forum, a kind of Central European Davos, and we had 2-3 days of discussions on everything, including digital sovereignty. And it strikes me, I mean, Poland is a fantastic example how a country can actually use digital as a springboard to develop itself. It has 8% of EU IT companies. It has 60%. It has 60,000 students in IT, and it's really becoming an IT powerhouse, at least in Europe. Yes, AI has been a part of those discussions. I would like to intervene briefly to give a little bit of perspective of what AI is good at and what it cannot do. I have to tell you also, in my engineering job, we are very much studying it in the context of Industry 4.0, Construction 4.0, intelligent buildings, intelligent cities, intelligent traffic. This is a little bit outside of this general artificial intelligence or large language models, but nevertheless important and nevertheless extremely promising at what could happen. But now allow me to demystify a little bit what AI is doing. And excuse me if I will be very simple on one end, but start with a maybe slightly sophisticated or well-referenced concept. It goes back to Aristotle. Difficult to say anything substantial without quoting him. And the point is, we have to realize that the way we are operating in the world, we are navigating what is called the semiotic triangle or Aristotelian triangle. And on the edges of this triangle, on one edge or on one corner, there's the real world. There's the material stuff that is out there, that's definitely exists, the material reality as such, as a mixture of atoms and molecules, etc., etc. And then there are symbols that we use to talk about that reality. So there are words, there are drawings, there are texts, letters, etc., etc. And finally, the third part of that triangle are the ideas that we have in our mind, not necessarily corresponding to the words. So the experiences in the psyche is what Aristotle is calling this, concepts, ideas, before they are uttered as a word. Large language models, ChatGPT and all this technology took everyone by surprise. Even my colleagues who work at the UNESCO Center for Artificial Intelligence, which we have in Ljubljana, they were surprised how quickly, how well it started to work. Also, the European Commission, with their AI Act, was surprised by it. Somehow, all this part of AI was not somehow foreseen in there. So that this tells you how quickly something can happen. But what these language models are doing is they are operating only in the symbolic corner of that triangle. So they are good at creating or analyzing texts, analyzing images, finding patterns in text and images, and continuing those patterns. They stay in the symbolic corner of the triangle. And they have no idea whatsoever about the real material world. And they have no idea whatsoever about the ideas and concepts that we have in our heads. To picture how or on what level AI operates, imagine an iceberg, right? It's a big iceberg. This iceberg could be you, could be me. What is sticking out of the water of that iceberg are the symbols, are the words, are the drawings, is what we communicate with others, with what others see of us. It's our language, it's our words, it's our text, it's our drawings. What you see below the surface are all our ideas in the mind, all our understanding, feelings, intuitions, but also concepts and theories, etc., etc. So the top of the iceberg is something that ChatGPT and all these systems are operating in. They don't have what is in the water, right? Now imagine the ocean itself in which this iceberg is floating. This ocean is the real world. ChatGPT is just at the tip of the iceberg. And that's why a lot of the stuff that we get from ChatGPT and similar system strike those who know who know the topic, who are not students who just need to write a seminar. They are lacking to see depth. It's all kind of sounds right, it all kinds of looks right, but if you scratch below the surface, if you would like to go below what is sticking out of the sea from the iceberg, it is somehow missing. It is somehow not there. And this is not something that you can improve upon by adding a couple of billions or trillions of parameters that were talked about. So in essence, what these systems are doing, in fact, very efficiently, is write stuff that nobody reads, draw stuff that nobody would look at these drawings. You always need, they are great to give you an inspiration. They are great to remind you that you forgot to write to mention something. But to produce a finished product, we are still far away from that. And the reason for this is that we as humans have a capacity of reducing problems, not seeing everything as a pattern and operating on the pattern level of things. But we have or built theories that somehow fit all those patterns. So we have theories behind how things work. We have models in our minds how the world works, and this is lacking in these systems. So for anything a little bit more complex, something that requires a few more steps, etc., etc., these things are not very good at. Stephen Wolfram, those of you who are a little bit more mathematically oriented may know a software called Mathematica. He said, well, maybe these things that ChatGPT is doing, and we are so surprised how fantastic artificial intelligence works. Maybe these things are not so difficult. So I agree. I mean, it has been mentioned by Ajit, as well as by Simon in one way. We got a great tool It's a great tool to analyze patterns and a great tool to continue patterns. There's great things that you can do with it, but to extrapolate and to think that because it sounds reasonable, that there is a reasonable entity that created that would be a mistake. It is just as a mistake if I would get a text from a student, a seminar assignment with which he was supposed to prove he knows things, it would read right, but if it is written by ChatGPT, this means he has no knowledge about it. So, digital world is exciting. There are things happening. There are things surprising us. It also tells us something about the potential of regulation. It seems that it's very difficult to foresee in which direction technology will be moving. So how do you do ex ante regulation on stuff that you don't exactly know which way it goes? And it continues to be an exciting area, an exciting topic to be at. And I could mention the strategic geopolitics security.
Looks like a freeze. Is it?
Yeah.
No?
No, it's back.
No, it's back
Yeah.
again. Ziga, we missed your final point about the geopolitics. If you'd just like to repeat that.
I was just saying that I will not go into it, but I can touch upon it if there's something to be said in the discussion.
Could I just ask you about one thing when you're talking about large language models, ChatGPT, and so on? I mean, as humans, need whatever it is to believe what we're being told by ChatGPT or whatever. I think we've got to be so cautious on this. I've seen things which are just plain wrong. And yet, and could, in an election year which is coming up, really boost the level of misinformation that there is that people have in to make their democratic decisions about. Is this something that you think we need more thought, work, communication about?
I mean, definitely. I think the grown-ups have somehow learned by now that if you see something on the internet, it's not necessarily true. And yes, we will be seeing their famous example with the Pope in that coat with very thick walls, etc., etc. It becomes so easy to do deep fakes. What AI is extremely good at is create stuff which looks right, which sounds right. Because it is using the patterns, it is learning from the patterns, it is learning how people talk, and it can beautifully generate I don't know, speeches or drawings or pictures of things, and you would be fooled by the fact that it looks right, because we understand that if somebody is capable of creating something that sounds right and looks right, we humans can only do this if we have a deep understanding of what we are writing about. And ChatGPT and all these systems can do it without any kind of understanding whatsoever, just by continuing the pattern that they are seeing. And yes, it's a danger. I think the DSA has been openly marketed as a tool that may prevent this in elections. We had, I think, in the last couple of years, 2 or 3 elective periods where I think we have been inoculated, we have been vaccinated against disinformation, against fake news. So I don't expect voters to fall for that as they did for man-made disinformation in the 2016 elections, for example, that started this whole disinformation scare.
Ziga, thank you very much for that, and I really hope you're right. Ajit, lots of points been made. Do you want to respond to some of the things you've heard from your colleagues?
I have exactly comments on both of them. Thank you very much, Simon and Ziga, for your feedback. I'll start with Simon first. So I think that the bit about Human augmentation, I didn't see it as a dichotomy between human augmentation and autonomous intelligence. Human augmentation is absolutely amazing, and we've always talked about that even in our report, and we as users are very much using the Microsoft Copilot and things like that, correct? So I think that human augmentation is a given. But remembering that we're talking about 2040 in this report, correct? So we're not talking about what is here today, but sort of where the trajectory is going. At that point, if you start to look at things like autonomous AI agents, which broadly even are possible today, that you give a higher level goal. So you say that I want to book a holiday to Greece. Then the AI effectively subcategorizes that into sub-goals and tries to execute each of those goals on their own and then give you a result. Now that could be looking at a corrosion problem. For example, you could send a picture of a ship to AI to say that, okay, tell me how do I fix all these rusted bits on the ship. And this is where you are sort of going towards this idea of autonomous AI. And that's even possible today. So that's my point, that I don't see the human augmentation and intelligent autonomy as a dichotomy, but on the other hand, also keeping the 2040 vision in mind is where we are going, is what we want to say. The second point regarding Ziga, very interesting discussion about Aristotle. I think the point is that this is a very well-known argument, though. I mean, however you want to say it about symbolic AI and stuff like that, including Stephen Wolfram has been talking about AI and symbolic AI since the 70s, correct? So AI has gone its up and down cycles. The symbolic AI crowd has had its sort of time, and now we are almost coming to the time where we have the sort of since Professor Hinton's paper in 2010, we're looking at the more the sort of neural vision of AI. That's not to say that the two could not coexist together. And the exact idea for that is neurosymbolic AI, which is effectively amalgamation of the neural vision as well as symbolic vision. But I wanted to point out that one of the reasons I didn't go down that route is because I think that vision from Wolfram and all the others has had its day and is not scalable. And I will sort of very interestingly have this discussion. But the point is that we need to think about things which will scale towards 2040. If it doesn't scale, it's interesting but local. And the final point is about the whole bit about ChatGPT. I think I didn't want to make the report about ChatGPT because it's very easy to be seduced by that, correct? Even between the time of January to now, the most interesting development in generative AI is actually Llama 2 from Meta or Facebook. So Llama 2 is an open source implementation, correct? And the significance of that, it is not what OpenAI is doing. It's not one big monolithic model. Rather, it allows you to run your own AI in your own firewall and to 3 flavors of large, medium, and small. So in my mind, I think that what we should be careful about is not to look at the world as it stands today and extrapolate it from that perspective. So that's my comments. Thank you.
Please, Simon, over to you.
So I was going to come back to this point on intelligence and the point about ChatGPT spurting out things which are incorrect, and then the point on sort of where we're going to in terms of autonomy, which Ajit was talking about. And there's a great paper which I put in the chat. Most people can't see the chat, but people have probably seen it, and I highly recommend it if you haven't, on Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence, GPT-4. So GPT-4 is the model ahead of the ChatGPT model, and it's the one that Microsoft are increasingly using in our products. Ajit's mentioned, Llama and others are kind of getting increasingly advanced. And what some of these studies looking at the extent to which it's getting towards AGI is that they're highlighting gaps in a way that, in a sense, for me is a good thing at the moment. Because one of the examples in this paper is that it's not very good at planned thinking, sort of planful thinking ahead and seeing around corners and working out, okay, when it starts, putting out text, it can do it in an incredibly competent way, both across mathematics and coding and language and any language, but it's not very good at sort of thinking ahead first about what the problem is and then kind of giving an answer. And the stage that we're at now, that means that it enhances the need for the human in the loop, which I think is a good thing. And it's sort of a good part of the learning process for us as sort of humanity using these technologies. I think it's great for, you know, I use it when my wife is revising for her orthopedic surgery consultancy exams. It makes me a much better research partner. I think that education applications are really interesting because, you know, a teacher can, you know, I don't think we should be so concerned about the idea of plagiarism for the reasons that Ziga has mentioned, but actually thoughtful use of it as a tool to get children to compare the answer they gave against an essay that the model writes, and then, you know, now go away and write a program using Copilot for coding and write a program that can give you an answer to that question, and all these kind of applications, using it as a research partner while you're doing a project, or using it as a maths revision partner. So all these kind of things which are human in the loop and actually using the model as a tool. In a way, the question then becomes to Ajit's point, what do we do when some of those gaps in the models are fixed? So, you know, we're already starting to see in some of the learning from graphs and recursive approaches to the models that some of these are being plugged. And so if we think forward to 2040, more and more of them will be plugged. So how do we continue to use it in those ways into the future, I think, is then the question that raises.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Ziga, did you have some other thoughts whilst we were in the car park that you want to add?
Yeah, maybe just a clarification on the symbolic AI. Indeed, there have we would be spoon feeding into the AI systems the ideas, the concepts, the theories of the world, and maybe explicitly teaching AI the rules, how this world operates, or it would learn itself from examples. And the statistical one would not have any things like that. It would just use statistical probability mathematics, and the neural networks are in the second part. Yeah. My point was not that the symbolic AI is better. My point was that we are using statistical methods, numerical methods, neural networks, to get results which are symbolic in principle. Behind those results, behind the stuff that AI is outputting, is zero theoretical knowledge, zero models, zero understanding of what this AI has been creating. This does not mean that this is not useful. It's extremely useful, as Simon was just saying. It reminds you of stuff. It shows you what kind of stuff you should write. It's a great assistant, but I think still a terrible master. Just a footnote on the autonomous system. Of course, it depends where you would like to have them, and there are areas where they are extremely desirable and have been operating rather well even before these latest breakthroughs in AI. For example, in intelligent buildings, in intelligent machinery, in intelligent, maybe not in your room, but intelligent evaluating the sensor data from fire alarms and when a fire alarm goes on and when it goes off, etc., etc. These systems are fairly autonomous right now. Nobody intervened to fire the alarm or to block an alarm. It could benefit from an AI that would maybe look at a few sensors and say, well, if it's only one sensor, probably it's a fault in this sensor, etc., etc. So it depends where you look at. Autonomous driving, for example, is something that everybody would like to have. Suffers from I think, from a problem that ChatGPT systems will be suffering until 2040, and that is, you cannot be sure that at some point it will not do a major stupid thing.
Thank you for that. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you both very much for that. Maybe we can make sure I don't know where I'm looking here, but maybe we can make sure that the paper that Simon you referred to, and I think Ziga may have put up on the screen there, that we can all access that later, because would that be okay? So we all get the address. Fantastic. Look, at this point, I'm going to throw it out to the floor for questions. Solomon is here with a microphone. would you mind saying who you are? And if you want to point it towards one or other, or I can ask all three to comment on your question. But we'll start with the gentleman here and then over to James over there. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Paul Ardern. I'd just like to say congratulations to all three speakers. I thought that was an excellent set of presentations. I think the thing I'd like to focus on is how society is going to adapt to these changes. They're coming very quickly. And the idea that Ajit can be thinking forward to 2040, I mean, it's very, very difficult, but somebody's got to do it. And these changes are coming, they're coming now. And there were about, how long ago was it, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, there was a big book about how many jobs would be lost as a result of AI. And those worries seem to have toned down a bit now. And there's more talk about augmentation and cooperative working. But it's still going to be a massive challenge. There's going to be a lot of displacement of people from jobs. What are all these people going to do? I'm very interested in what Simon said about education, not just in how it's going to be delivered, but what should the content be to adapt society to these changes? It's a breathtaking challenge, and I wondered if the speakers might like to elaborate on those kind of issues.
Yeah, please. Your question follows us. I'll take James as well then. Solomon, if you can manage the mic. So what kind of changes, what kind of world, what kind of employment worlds? Thank you very much, Paul. James.
Yes, I just wanted to mention 2 points. Firstly, that the European Internet Forum, which the report which I just presented, Pilar, our speaker, is the chairman of that and has been the chairman for 15 years. So she had a very strong interest to be present here with us this morning. But my question is to Ajit and then obviously to the other 2 speakers if they wish to contribute. But looking towards 2040, this document is not just focusing on 20, it's also preparing the ground for the next legislature in the EU, which is 24 to 2029, elections next year. Here in our country, we have elections too. So, Ajit, what are the 3 major issues that you see that legislators and the policy process should be looking at over these next 5 years? Because the domain is vast, as you have said, Tony, but I think that out of this work, there are maybe 3 really important issues, so that then that helps in part to answer that question and then feeding this debate. So, Ajit, maybe you could clarify.
Ajit, do you want to kick off and then I'll come to...
Sure. So thank you for the question, both of you, James, as well. I'll start off with James' question because that hopefully might answer your question as well. So the 3 major issues, it looks like a daunting task, but to a certain extent, it's not, because the question is about regulation and enabling it, correct? So this is the thing. I would say first of all would be the emphasis on education, and the education part of it is not the traditional education. I'm talking about a variety of different things. The second is the geopolitics, because when we had a discussion online with EIF members, I think the geopolitics links to values, and that's kind of a discussion. And the third one is jobs, and jobs are connected to education to a large extent, which is partly what your question goes to that. Now I'll quickly take your question and then I'll come back to this one. So the challenge here is the rate of change, correct? And if you look at what Alvin Toffler was talking about in Future Shock, or books like that, correct? They didn't have to contend with this, and this was in the 70s when he was talking about Future Shock. And now we are talking of an exponentially large scale of things. And the only way you can really fix that is education. And this is something I'll quickly mention about what we are doing. It's a kind of an open initiative, and I'm very fortunate to have Alex here with me as well. So what we looked at was that I have a lot of people at being in Oxford who want to work with us, correct, work on AI. And we thought, how about we create a network or a community which brings in people who are in the industry, who want to work with people like me. And I have also a sort of a group of people from academia. And we openly write and publish papers, correct? Because what that means is that that's your certificate, yes? And that's a very democratic way of doing something. And it's a hugely disruptive idea. The fact that you don't need a PhD, you can have, I mean, today the biggest qualification in AI is a Kaggle Grandmaster. I don't know how many people know. Who knows what Kaggle is? It's interesting. Kaggle is a initiative acquired by Google, but it's a very democratic thing. Anybody in the world, you can throw a challenge, and anybody in the world solves that problem. And it's more valuable, I think, than a PhD. So I've got a friend who's got she is triple Kaggle grandmaster, and the world is open to her, and she's 22, I think. So this is my point, is that that's the sort of rethinking of education completely fundamentally that we need to do, because it's too hard to have a 5-year PhD or whatever we do. And it's too expensive, to be honest, correct? I mean, let's face it. And what do you do after that? So that's hopefully that answers the questions.
Thank you very, very much. Can I, Simon?
You have something follow up?
Well, I was just going to say that's going to be, I mean, part of my question was about how do we handle the
Yeah.
disruption, and that's going to turn higher education upside down. It turns out that higher education is mainly about the people you're going to get to know when you're at college.
Exactly.
And it's not
Exactly.
really about the knowledge.
Exactly.
So what are the universities going to do? It's going to be-
Well, it is going to be disruptive, including the universities. I also say that coming from Oxford, correct? I mean, that's perfectly, everybody is going to have to contend with this idea is what is their future and what is the value they uniquely bring.
Okay, just thank you for that. Simon, do you want to also, your thoughts on the questions that have been put?
Very briefly, in the interest of time, thank you. I thought it was a really, really good question, really important question. And I think, I mean, I completely agree with the point that we need to ask the right questions, and then we need to think about what are the impacts across society, across the workforce. I think the risk is in a lot of the policy discussion at the moment, we're being too local and we're focusing on too sort of a parochial way, rather than thinking actually what are some of those questions. So we should be thinking about if we were thinking about any given constituency in the UK, for example, what's the data on roles that will be displaced, potentially replaced by autonomous? Where are the opportunities for augmentation, and where are the and how do you lean into those and create the skills and help with education and everything else that's going to be needed for that? And as the sort of question suggested, when you start to think of it in that way, the challenge is huge. But, and this kind of goes back to something you said, Lord Holt, right at the beginning, when we think about the UK in that sort of global geopolitical context, the UK is actually in a pretty good place. So we do need to be thinking about some of those questions systemically, bottom up, how are we empowering people to use the technology? And then the other point that I would make is globally, I think there needs to be more focus on how do we get the regulatory architecture in an interoperable way, and look at successes in the past. Look at, for example, International Civil Aviation Organization, look at maritime and other organizations where you've got a sort of global framework that works to the extent that planes can fly from one country to another. We need to be able to deploy AI across countries in a way that is sort of globally understood as safe, and there is a framework, but then each domestic regulatory regime is able to build from that and do it in a safe way locally. So I think there's the sort of focusing on really bottom up from the users and how you empower them, and then the really sort of big picture, how does this work globally and what's the UK's position in that?
Thank you. Ziga, do you want to say anything? I'm conscious we've got probably time for one more question. If you want to add anything briefly, I'd be very grateful. But
very briefly, as to Paul's question, I've wrote a book for Martin Center on the future of work. I think it still holds. I think you will see those countries where they will use a lot of AI, they will also have lower unemployment, and vice versa. As to James's challenge, I would put in the list of 3 permissionless innovation. We have to innovate, and we have to innovate so that we create strategic interdependence, that we are part of the strategic interdependence network, because nobody is technologically independent today. There were some studies by Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. They found the US is about 46% depending on others, China 60-something, Germany 80-something percent dependent. So interdependence is the only thing that that can work, and innovation policies and also legislation policies should be geared at that.
thank you very much. And Simon keeps putting up things for us to read, which is great, and we'll make sure we've got that. Time for one more brief question. Who else would like? Who would like to ask the final question? Is someone? Yep.
Yeah, hello, thank you very much. So my name is Tuğçe Yalçın. I'm a dual qualified counsel Taylor Wessing. So thank you very much to Simon, Ziga, and also Ajit for the very interesting introduction and input. My question is basically following up on Simon's last input, that to empower and use technology is coped also with the challenge of having a regulatory architecture and global framework. This is especially interesting for me as a lawyer. And I would be interested on your idea. I know this is a very fundamental question, but how do you see the tension between, on the one hand, to empower technology, but on the other hand, kind of lead the market to define and develop the technology, but also allow, to a certain extent, states to impose restriction to mitigate the risk? I know it's a very fundamental question, but do you have an idea, suggestion, how would you cope with this challenge and the tension between, on the one hand, having the freedom to use technology and develop it, on the other hand, to mitigate the risk and impose certain restrictions? Thank you very much.
An absolutely fundamental question. Would you like to start off, or?
I'll briefly say that, because I think it's more important that Ziga and Simon look at that.
Yeah.
So thank you for your question, Tusha. So I think what struck me was Ziga's comment about permissionless innovation. Correct. I think that's the crux of it. And in the democracy, especially, I think that's one of the key drivers of it. So I would suggest that is the way to go. There is, of course, the mitigation side, which is always a discussion, correct? I mean, and when the moment you do permissionless innovation, look at Uber, for example, correct? I mean, you always have somebody on the other side who doesn't like that innovation. So that's my comment on that.
Thank you very much. Simon, any brief comments to that really good question?
Yeah, I'll be really brief, but it's a big question. So I would say that they're not in tension is a really important point. So I think if we think of it as a trade-off between being safe and responsible and sort of regulating it in a good way and the opportunity, I don't think that's the way it's going to be. And I guess you can use the aviation analogy. British Airways wouldn't feel safe flying to a country that didn't have a safe way to land a plane. And I think the same way we need to start thinking about, you need to have a regulatory structure in order to deploy safe AI safely and using that technology in a country. So actually, safety should be fundamental to the market opportunity and your ability to deploy AI. There's lots more to say, but in the interest of time, that would be where I'd start.
Thank you, Simon. Ziga?
In the interest of time, I would say that things are too unpredictable for kind of attempts of ex ante regulating everything before it even grew. I think the common law tradition is that you wait that there are some disputes and then you create law solving those disputes. Let's wait for that. I think you would have faster innovation if you approach it this way. I think it's also one of the competitive advantages of the common law countries that were not upfront hindered by people who would want to regulate anything before it blossoms.
Brilliant. Well, in the old showbiz words, leave the audience wanting more. I wish this could carry on. You know, you three have been absolutely brilliant. Ziga, Simon, thank you very much for participating remotely. I know it's sometimes odd not being there, but you've done in the room, but you've done so well. Thank you both very much. Really interesting facts and stuff which have come out. And Ajit, thank you for a brilliant presentation and your answers too. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.